Tuesday. Carly gave a great introduction to myself. I also want to just take a moment. Matt Bolt is also with us this morning. Matt, do you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Matt. I also work at the Colorado School of Public Health with Bailey. We're on the same collaboration with our work for the Women's Health Ludeman Center. And yeah, Bailey and I work together to do a lot of power analyses and sample size calculations for you guys. And yeah, it's just great working with her and working with all of you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So this morning, I hear a little bit of echo. If you could mute. Thanks. This morning, feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. I want this to be informal. I've got a slide deck that I'll go through this morning, and at the end, obviously, there'll be time for questions, but don't hesitate to jump in at any time if you have questions. My goal for this morning is to really just give you some perspective about what you should know about biostatisticians as you walk into these collaborations. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we'll talk about forming these collaborative relationships. And we really hone on this word collaborative rather than consulting. We want you to see us as collaborators as part of your research. That's really our desire to be on these teams. We'll talk about logistics of finding a biostatistician and working with them. We'll talk about prep work on your end that can really help maximize your time together with the biostatistician. Resources specifically on our campus, navigating the relationship. So we'll talk about like when things get a little bit icky and you're just having struggles getting what you were hoping for out of the relationship. You know, what are some things to think about in those settings? And then at the end, depending on time, I'll do just a short little statistics refresher. So this is not meant to be an extremely technical talk at all. This is really just meant to kind of prepare you to walk into these collaborative relationships. So first of all, let's start off with just what is a biostatistician, right? This is you might not think about this, but oftentimes when I say I'm a biostatistician, the first thing that sometimes a person will ask is, what does that mean, right? So a biostatistician is really a person who applies principles of study design and statistical methodology to address public health or biomedical research. So in this talk, you'll hear me interchangeably use biostatistician or just statistician. A biostatistician is someone that just typically is focused on the public health or biomedical research questions, compared to a statistician is just the more broad term. Typical activities involve study design, power and sample size determinations, writing up statistical analysis sections of grants. We can be involved in data cleaning and wrangling, although sometimes I would say that that's something that you can often participate in, or we have data analysts that are specifically trained to do that. Presenting results, working with co-investigators to write up manuscripts. So those are kind of the array of things that we may be involved in. Another thing that I want to point out here is that many biostatisticians, including myself, also devote time to developing new statistical methods to address unsolved statistical problems. So as I'm developing my career, I typically think about it as having two arms. One of it is the collaborative side, where I get excited to work with researchers like you and assist on your projects. And then the other side is developing new statistical methods to address problems that haven't been solved. So sometimes those things can marry quite well, where I will find a collaborative project and I can notice right away, hey, you have some real nuances to your data that make it unique. And we might need to extend existing methods in order to rigorously analyze it. And so that's honestly the best of both worlds for me, because then I get to not only fulfill that collaborative side, but I'm also doing this new statistical methodology development that often will turn into a publication in a statistics journal. So Matt actually helped prepare this slide, and he said, how do you talk with statisticians or biostatisticians? The first thing we'd say is pretend that we don't have advanced degrees. So oftentimes I find the first time when I sit down with a collaborator, they will start wanting to jump in right away to say, okay, my hypothesis, I think, is this. And so the power I need is this. And we are kind of, you're like jumping way too far ahead for us. So our biology is rusty at best. On the right here, just for entertainment, is a picture of me in freshman year of high school at an impressive 5.6. That was the last time that I took a biology class. Next to me is Matt. If you've met Matt, then you would know that he trumps me in height, probably in other things as well. He was only 6'6" at this point. I'm not sure exactly how tall he is now, but this was him in high school. And so just realize that like that's kind of where we're starting with the science. However, understanding the scientific context and the motivation for your study is really important for us to get an idea of how you're thinking about the project and where you're trying to go. So when we sit down, we actually just want to hear first just, the maybe longer elevator pitch understanding of what you're actually researching. Why were you measuring these variables? What do you hoping to accomplish in this study in terms of the science? And then eventually we'll get into the statistical elements and we'll start trying to label things as independent variables or outcomes or dependent variables and predictors. And we'll start talking about it, how is the data collected? Is this a cross-sectional study? Is this a longitudinal study, et cetera? But when you sit down with us, at the beginning, we're really just going to try to start to understand where you're coming from. It's like doing your baseline vitals, if you were, when you show up to a doctor's office. So I really encourage you that when you work with a biostatistician to come in with this collaborative mindset for setting these expectations. Again, many biostatisticians are interested in leading or co-leading projects and papers. So for example, one of the things for my promotion that they would like to see as in this collaborative arm is to be a co-I on grants. So yes, I obviously will be listed, as just a senior personnel, or there might even just be a little bit of money set aside for consulting on some projects that require less biostatistical support. However, one of the things that we often want to look at also is trying to develop those more collaborative roles where we are more integral in the science itself for these bigger studies. Again, many are interested in developing statistical methods. And so we're looking for interesting projects where new methods can be judiciously applied. Again, that's kind of like the best of both worlds when we're able to do that in the same project. And if that happens, then you might actually be an author on a statistical methods paper. So again, if your data, sometimes when I write a statistical methods paper, what I'm doing is outlining a new method, and hopefully it's general enough that it applies in a number of settings. And if I can use your data set to illustrate it in that paper, then I will of course include you as a co-author. Or even if your data set motivated the development of that new method, I'll include you as a co-author on that paper. And again, building this collaboration will pay dividends with respect to future projects, because the beauty of it is that if we can develop long-term collaborations, when you come up with your next R01 idea, then I already have an idea of what you're working on and why you're studying this and how you tend to evaluate or what type of measurements you use. And so you don't have to start from the beginning again. That's the best part of this. So again, what are my collaborative goals? The first is to translate your clinical research question into statistical terms, which again, just requires this translation. Identify what and how the data are collected that will answer the question. And again, you may have already done this, but I'm independently thinking through this process just to make sure that we're not missing anything. And then finally, aid in performing the analysis of the data to provide an answer to the question. So one of the beauties of this as we talk about this collaboration is that, sometimes it can be great if you can develop your careers together. So you might think that it would be really advantageous to have the most senior biostatistician on your grant. However, there's a lot of benefits if you can find one at a similar stage. Maybe not, someone that, like if you're a postdoc, you don't probably need to find just another postdoc biostatistician because who knows where they're going to end up in a couple of years. But if you can find a more junior biostatistician or, maybe mid-career biostatistician, then it's great because they can be with you for a number of years. And then hopefully they're not already overcommitted on other projects. And I like to include just some obvious comments at the bottom. Again, hopefully these are obvious to you, but sometimes I get involved in projects and people will say, so why are you involved in that project? And I'll be like, oh, the people are really fun, right? And that's really my answer, is because they're fun to work with and their science is interesting. And so just remember that, people like to work with people that they trust. You're trying to build this long-term relationship. People like to work with people that see their contributions as crucial. So that's another thing that I'm hoping that you'll gain out of this talk this morning, is just beginning to understand that, again, we really want to be seen as these collaborators rather than these consultants most of the time on projects. And finally, people work a little bit harder for the people that appreciate them. So there's this blog called Simply Statistics, and there was a guest post by Elizabeth Matzi, and she had some great suggestions. I didn't love the title of her blog because I think it was called The Care and Feeding of the Biostatistician, which I didn't love, but I did appreciate some of her suggestions for working with biostatisticians. A couple of these were be respectful of time. I think that's true for any collaborative relationship. Understand that your biostatistician is not a computational tool. So you could make every effort you can to learn biostatistics, again, or the language of biostatistics. We don't expect you to come in and say, here are independent variables, dependent variables, here's the analytic tool and the hypothesis test that I need to use. We don't expect that. But if we can begin to find this common language, that will make our meetings more efficient and allow us to progress more quickly just in the project. When all else fails, and even when it doesn't, draw pictures. Right? Just sometimes just sitting down a simple picture can really help us understand the biology of what you're thinking about, or even if you can just like hash out, here's what I think the data might look like, that we can begin to talk about concerns or questions that we have leading into a project. Teach them your language, right? This is, again, we want to learn a little bit about your science and be able to communicate it clearly. And generously share your data and ideas. So sometimes when you come in and you're looking for some advice on how to handle the data, we'll ask if you can share some data with us. And that's not because we want to take it and go publish it on our own, but sometimes it just helps us to get our hands on the data, to get an understanding of what you're seeing, and just to give a different perspective on it. So we really appreciate when you're willing to let us in like that. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about logistics of working with a biostatistician. So early on, some important things that you might want to discuss, and this again is true of any collaboration, is frequency and timing and necessity of meetings. You know, are you just going to let us know how things are going? Do we want to establish a monthly half-hour check-in just to talk about where you're at, any questions you have? Preferred format of the results. Any known deadlines you have, please give us those in advance, because that's helpful for us just as we're managing a lot of different competing priorities. So to give you an idea, again, as Carly talked about, I have an agreement with the Ludeman Center. So part of my work is to support researchers like you, which is one of my favorite parts of my job. However, I also teach an advanced probability class for the PhD students in biostatistics. I also am the director of the Masters of Public Health program for biostatistics. I also work with people in emergency medicine. So I've got a lot of things on my plate, and it can make for the best use of everyone's time, and trying to avoid rushing deadlines approaching if we know those things in advance. Level of detail of desired results. So that can also fall into just if you have tables that you want filled, give us a template of the table of what you're thinking of. Then we can help fill in those numbers. And finally, it's always great to have conversations about authorship and final review of manuscripts. So, we all take a lot of pride in our work. As biostatisticians, we don't want to see your science going out the door with inaccurate numbers or inaccuracies in how we're either interpreting the results or presenting the results. And so we always want to be able to have time to do that final review of a manuscript or abstract to double check everything. But obviously that takes time. So just having those deadlines on the calendar and knowing when you can get us a draft and all those types of things is very helpful. So when should I contact a statistician? Really, we say whenever, right? Earlier is always better. So as you start a project, if you know you're going to need a biostatistician, start to reach out and figure out who the right person is to involve. Maybe you already have one you've been working with. You can give them a heads up of hey, in the next 6 months, I'm planning on this grant submission or resubmitting this grant. That's really helpful. Sample size calculations, analysis plans are not insignificant. They still take some time. And so if you can contact us earlier, we can just start thinking through what is the information that we're going to need. Again, if you give us more time, we can always do more thorough work. And if there's less pressure, you inevitably will get better work as well. So again, when you have a project or grant idea, try to reach out to a biostatistician. We'll talk in a moment about resources on campus and where to find one. Bring as detailed of a draft as possible of where you're at. So whether you're doing your data analysis, whether you're preparing a grant proposal, And then be open, depending on, again, where you are in the study, to refining your research question. We're going to ask questions about, why are you doing these things this way? Have you considered maybe recruiting these two groups of patients, or splitting it into 4 groups? And so obviously, if you've completed the study, we're not going to go back to those questions at the beginning, but just be ready, again, to walk into this, to hopefully have an open conversation about what are aspects of the study design that are fixed, that are non-negotiable, and we'll talk about, like, how can we then make the most efficient study design if that's not already established already. Be clear what you're expecting. So are you looking for us to help with randomization? Are you looking for data management or data archiving? Coming in with these expectations at the beginning can be really helpful. Initiating a biostatistician late in a project. So this is where we say, really try to avoid this. Sometimes it can't be avoided, but and when it can't, then we just ask you to have realistic expectations. So as an example, let's suppose that you run the analyses for your study, you write up a paper, submit it, and the reviews come back saying you need a biostatistician. This is not an uncommon occurrence. If you have funds, then you're gonna need to support the biostatistician as they become familiar with the data. They may take a different approach to the analysis, and it might change some of the results. But again, hopefully they're just either taking a more accurate approach or a more suitable approach for the data that you have, or they might be using more complex methods that allow us to get the better, account for some, say, confounders or other covariates. And so hopefully, again, you're getting a more rigorous, accurate result, but just be aware that that may happen. If you plan to run the analyses yourself, that's great, but just understand that biostatisticians may not be able to give the best advice without seeing the data. This is a little bit like having a virtual health appointment with your doctor versus seeing them in person, right? There's only so much that we can do through a virtual, or just like talking about your data in the abstract. So again, the motto that is often said is, come early, come often. Don't ever feel like, oh, I don't have a ton yet to share. That's okay. You can still establish that relationship, and we can begin to start talking about the science and get the context established. This is a famous quote from Ronald Fisher that says, to consult a statistician after an experiment is finished is often merely to ask him to conduct a post-mortem examination. He can perhaps say what the experiment died of. So, and this is a reality as well, right? Unfortunately, sometimes when we are engaged really late in the process, we have serious concerns about how the study was performed. And there's not much that we can do to kind of remedy things at that point. So, most of the time this is not happening, but it can. And so this is, again, just another reason to engage in a biostatistician early. So what's some prep work then that can happen on your end before you start jumping into a collaborative relationship? The first thing, and probably the most important thing, is what we're going to call tidy data. Some of you may have heard this before, this might be a new term. It's actually becoming more of a formal term in statistics over the last, say, 5 or 10 years. And it's more or less what it sounds like, right? Tidy data. First of all, tidy data is a reflection also of the amount of effort, I would say, that you put into your data. Tidy data tells us, like, you really like this project. Messy data tells us, like, not my favorite project, right? The same kind of thing with how you keep your room or anything. Another quote here that Matt shared that I liked is, a place for everything and everything in its place. So what is actual tidy data? The more formal definition is that we have 1 row per observation. So if you think here in the bottom right, here I'm showing observations. Every row is an observation, or you can think a participant in your study. And every column is a variable or measurement on that observation. In the tidy data, there's no manipulation of the data. So there's no highlighting. If you're thinking about, if you pull this up in Excel, we pull things up in Excel too to visualize them. That's not a bad thing. We use other more advanced statistical software to analyze it. But for example, we don't have highlighting to indicate for certain individuals, because then when we pull the data into our advanced statistical software program, that highlighting is lost, okay? We also don't do any summarizing within the data itself. We will do that in a different file or a different sheet, for example. So here's just a picture of tidy data conceptually. You can think about it as you would about a road map. So for example, on the left here, you see this beautiful grid, right, of Colorado Boulevard and 287. This is the kind of place where I would want to drive around, because I know that if I got a little bit lost, that's okay. I would be able to find my way. On the right here, you see these other snapshots of other areas. For example, Cherry Creek Shopping Center with the river coming through, and MLK over here. And you see that all of a sudden the roads start going diagonal at Downing Street, whereas they were going these horizontal before. And then down over here, you can see like Highway 83 is cutting this weird direction. And so some of these roads like dead end, Elm Street curves over to the left. Like this is where I would be wed to my GPS every moment, because I would be so worried that I was going to get caught in one of these weird like circles or something and never be able to find my way out. So again, we want tidy data, something that's really easy to navigate. So let me give you an example here. Let's suppose that you had data on, this is just gross domestic product in 2021. So we have abbreviations for the countries, we have the ranking based on their gross domestic product, the actual name of the country, and then the GDP in millions of dollars. Okay. At the bottom here, we have the mean and the standard deviation. And then we have a couple of notes about the units, and we're reminding ourselves that we shouldn't forget to run the t-test. I don't know what we're testing, but we're running a t-test. So let's highlight some real problems here. So first of all, in yellow, we have the mean and standard deviation. These are these summary measures that are within the same data sheet. Again, if I were to go try to pull this into one of my software programs, it would just spit out an error message. It would say absolutely not. Okay. The other thing here is you'll notice that we use 2 rows for this label, millions of US dollars. It might look nice here because we can read all of it. However, again, the advanced data software packages are not going to have any idea how to read this. So how can we transform this data to be tidy data? Well, what we can do is, first of all, move all the data. If you flip back for a second, we want to start here at A1 in the spreadsheet. So we're going to move back, and we're going to label these as country, ranking, economy, and USD. So notice here, just simple labels that we know what each of them mean. And then there's nothing else in the data sheet. So I've removed, I'm not showing the rest of the data sheet, but I've removed, for example, that mean and standard deviation, any notes about a t-test, anything like that. If you want to have a different sheet within this Excel workbook, that's absolutely fine to have those notes in it and those summary measures. We just want that there to be one sheet that just has the data by itself in this tidy form. Okay, so a little bit more on data here. It's often said that 80% of data analysis is spent on the process of cleaning and preparing the data. This is one aspect that I think is so commonly overlooked in terms of the data analysis, that there's a potential, depending on how comfortable you are with some basic data analysis, that you can actually do this a lot of it yourself before you're ever engaging the biostatistician or handing over your data to the biostatistician. Right? This is just looking at basic summaries of each of your variables to make sure, are you missing values that you shouldn't be missing? Can you go fill those in? Do you have any outliers that would seem to be like data misentry errors, things like that? So this is a big part of the project that, again, just always think about when you're thinking about your timeline of how quickly something can get done. This is something that we never want to skip over. It's a huge important step, and it takes quite a bit of time. Also, along with your data set, your tidy data, you need to have a data dictionary, right? This is a separate document, or sometimes just a different sheet within your Excel workbook that describes the content. So you would have each of your variable names and then a description of what it is. And again, there's a link here talking about just reproducibility and how to set up a data dictionary. In terms of the format, ideally, all of your data for a statistical analysis would be numeric. So categorical variables, for example, ideally have numbers associated with them. This makes it a lot easier for the person entering the data to do less typing and prevents us from having errors. So open text fields should really be avoided. So for example, let's suppose that race was one of the variables. You could code 1 for white and 2 for Native American. And then in your code book, in your data dictionary, you would have, race listed out, and you would have these, you would write out what these codings are. So 1 is equal to white, 2 is Native American, 3 is Black, etc. On the data collection side, since a lot of you are proposing these studies and actually working through data collection, if you're creating variable names, can be as descriptive as possible. But beware having extremely long names. So notice in our tidy data example, we abbreviated the millions of US dollars variable to just USD, right? So again, we want it to be descriptive, but not excessively long. Be consistent about spacing, underlining, capitalization, things like that. That just makes it easier when we're doing the analysis that we know, oh, she always does, for example, like systolic blood pressure pre, so SBP might be underscore pre, and then SBP underscore post. So therefore I can easily pull out what the pre and post blood pressure measurements were. Note, when you have pre and post data, we always need to be able to link the participants. Okay, so this can become, sometimes when people anonymize their data, we have actually seen this happen. They will forget to have an ID for the person that's for which they took measurements on. And then what happens is they actually cannot link up their pre and post data. This is a terrible incident because we want to be able to look at differences as people change after intervention. And so always make sure that you have some type of identifier to connect for your pre and post data. So how should you store your data? What electronic database should you use? You can absolutely use Excel, especially if it's a small data set. Access is another one where you have a little bit more control over your variables. However, I'd imagine that most of you are probably using REDCap, and we would encourage you to do that, as that can be accessed through the university. So REDCap stands for Research Electronic Data Capture, and it is a secure HIPAA compliant web-based database. There's easy online training available. It allows for direct data entry via online forms, or you can also get a public URL where people can go enter in data. There's automated data export for common statistical package. So if you are using, say, SAS or Stata, or I typically use R, as well as Excel, it can easily export. For longitudinal data, it will connect the data points across time points, even if the timing may be different between the groups. So it has all of that capability. Finally, it can also allow you to select stratification variables for randomization. So if if you start a REDCap database, you can actually have it randomize for incoming participants into different groups, by group or by site for you as well. A quick reminder about PHI. So we don't want PHI information, right? When you have your data set and then you get ready to work with your biostatistician, hopefully you'll, again, do some cursory checks at the beginning to make sure that you're not missing any data that you should. You can maybe just look at some summary statistics of your variables to make sure that you don't have outliers. But another thing that we want you to strip out before you're ever sharing it with us is any type of PHI. So, Matt made this point to us. This cute baby is merely a point on the graph. I would still say it's a very cute baby, but we don't want its name, right? This should just have some participant ID, baby 1, baby 13, that we then have all the information, that all of the, say, measurements for that are relevant for your study. So again, anytime you're about to share your data, we really just want the pieces that are relevant to the study and to answering your scientific question. So let's take a minute and talk about resources on campus, right? Your first question might be, okay, where do I find a biostatistician? Well, one thing to note is that your department, division, or group may have a dedicated biostatistician. So again, Matt and I work with researchers that are part of the Ludeman Center. However, we are not, 100% of my time is not that. So if every single one of you came to me tomorrow and said, hey, can you be my biostatistics collaborator? I would say, unfortunately not. We are still available, again, to handle a subset of the projects that come through that are underneath the Women's Center. But the other resource that's on campus is the Center for Innovative Design and Analysis, or CIDA. Again, you might ask, though, your department or the division if they have a biostatistician that already has carved out FTE to help you, because you can leverage those resources. But if not, CIDA is on campus for anyone and everyone. So again, go in with the mindset of wanting to find a collaborator. So if you have options of who can be your biostatistician, you might actually meet with a couple of them briefly and try to find a good match, right? In terms of interests, skills, etc. So as I mentioned, a lot of biostatisticians are also doing methods development or have just an area of expertise that they like working in. So, an example is Adane is a researcher in CETA, and his expertise is in survival analysis. And so I recently helped pair him up on a project where they needed a lot of survival analysis expertise. Why? Because he has interest and expertise in that area, and that's exactly what's needed for their project. There's other biostatisticians that focus a lot on longitudinal data and time series modeling. So if that's what you need, then you can try to find someone with that expertise. Oftentimes for junior researchers, just in their study designs, they're pretty bread and butter or more simple. And so really any biostatistician can help you with that. But if you do plan, for example, to use any high dimensional data, for example, image data or wearable devices, genomics even, let's try to find someone that specializes in that kind of data. It just prevents the prep work on the biostatistician side of making sure that they're running an analysis that's suitable for your data. And so it maximizes efficiency of the collaboration. So I'm going to spend just a little bit talking about CETA here. So this is the website. I've listed it at the bottom, but if you just Google CETA, CEU, this will come up. And this is a great resource on campus that can really help you with any type of biostatistical support that you might need. So first of all, who's in CETA? There's 14 PhD faculty and 18 master's faculty. There's also 10 graduate student trainees. So there's a bunch of people there with a lot of expertise. The director is Nicole Carlson, and I list the names here of just the other people that help direct the center in case any of them are familiar. Mary Samuel, for example, also has an appointment with OBGYN, if you're familiar with her. Katerina Purchase is an expert in omics data. So if you're, she's a great one to reach out for those cases. But really, the expertise of CETA is extensive. So on the left here, I've just listed analytic methods, which some of these you may know, like survival analysis, or at the bottom, clinical trials design and analysis. And they're familiar with all sorts of data structures and different types of studies. So they can help you deal with missing data. They can help you deal with, wearable or sensor data, like I said, image data. So again, there's just a lot of people. And when you engage CETA and you start to say, hey, I'm looking for a biostatistician that can help me on my study, what they're going to be doing is trying to figure out who the right person is, hopefully, to connect you with that matches both the analytic methods that you might need and the types of data that you have. So there's 4 different ways that you can engage with CETA, or at least 4, I'd say 4 main ways. The first one is that they offer 1-hour consultations. So these are free, and they can really help if you have basic questions, or if you're trying to figure out, I know I need biostatistical support, but I don't know at what level, and I don't know where to go next. A 1-hour consultation would be a great way to start to engage. We're located in building 500, by the way, on the 3rd floor within the biostatistics and informatics, or right adjacent to the biostatistics and informatics department. Another thing you can do is come on for one-time project support. So this is when you need statistical support for, say, 1 month to up to 1 year, some amount of FTE for an analyst, or maybe, sorry, one-time project support can even just be some consulting money. So it doesn't have to be FTE. You can, however, also look into a long-term partnership, or MOU. That's what we actually have with the Women's Center for myself and Matt. Or if you want help with grant development. The big key here is that you have to contact them a minimum of 60 days prior to submission. So if you are coming to them, say 45 days or even like 50 days prior to submission, they'll probably say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. They can often provide a rough letter of support. This is a free service. However, the expectation is that some biostatistical support would be written into the grant. So again, the 60-day mark is really the kicker here. And this is just to allow enough time to work with you on any sample size calculations, power analyses, and statistical analysis plans for the grant. So if you go to the CETA website and you click on Connect with Us, it will bring up this page. And you can see here's one-time project for, again, these short-term projects, a 10 to 1 hour consult. You're allowed 2 of these, I think, within 60 days. So this is a great thing to click on if that's what you're looking for. Or again, if you know you have a grant, I would draw your attention to this top right. that's where you would start a grant form. And then this takes you to an online form where they'll have you fill out a little bit of information about your study, and then you will get contacted pretty quickly. So let's talk a little bit about navigating the relationship with a biostatistician. So I have a few slides here about time and effort. And again, this I just want you to take as guidelines. There's no hard and fast rules for determining percent effort on a project. Typically, when you start working with a biostatistician, they'll be able to tell you, like, this is about how much time this would take or how much effort I would need, support I would need to help you on this project. As a general rule, typically no biostatistician wants to be on, say, 20% projects at 5% each, effort each, right? That's one of the reasons that we set up MOUs when we know a lot of little projects might come in, like through the Women's Center, is so that we can avoid this. 20 projects is just way too many for us to manage at one time. And as you can imagine, inevitably, everyone has the same deadline, right? So then what we do is get pinged by 20 different PIs looking for this analysis all done at the same time, and it's just impossible to do well. To give you an idea, 5% effort covers roughly like the services rendered in preparing a grant application. So you can think that there's going to be planning meetings ahead of time. The biostatistician would do power and sample size analysis, writing grant sections, maybe 1 and 1.5 hour meetings during the grant period, if you were to write them in at 5%. But really, they're not taking on any of the analysis. This is really as more of a consulting role, just to be there to oversee and give suggestions on how things should go. It's common for PhD level biostatisticians to require additional funding to cover master's level biostatistician when working with them. So don't be surprised when you contact, like, if, let's suppose that you were writing an R01 and you contacted me and said, Bailey, we'd love to write you in on this to help us out. I would ask, say if Matt was available, can I also write in some time for Matt? And the reason is because, again, I have a lot of competing priorities. And so typically I say that, like, I'm the slowest person and the worst person that you want to be the first person to do, like, in charge of the data analysis. I would rather work with Matt. He's an amazing data analyst. And I would work with him to oversee kind of the plans that are happening so that you do have that PhD level biostatistician working with you. But then I can, direct Matt and say, hey, can you go clean the data or make sure that it's ready to go, run these analyses, and then Matt and I would collaborate and work together to make sure that we get all the results that you would need for your study. Often in those cases, it makes sense to increase the percentage of effort over the life of the grant for this master's level statistician. So for example, I might agree and say, okay, yep, I just need to be 5% in years 1 and 2 when you're doing the data collection. Maybe my effort increases a little bit in years 3 and 4, and in year 5, when it's really about, like, putting things together, finishing up papers, disseminating results, I have a larger percentage. And then, maybe the master's, that's when Matt would start to sign on, say in year 3, to help us through year 5 to analyzing that data and getting results out. Here are some other just kind of templates that I've seen that were suggested through another faculty member through CETA. For example, if you had a K award, it might be worth just putting a master's level statistician on that or data analyst on that at, say, 10% effort again for years 1 and 2, and then maybe 20% in year 5. Sometimes we're comfortable doing this with master's level statisticians that have a bit of experience and can be independent on a project. Otherwise, we might put a little bit of PhD effort, or maybe you'll just have a PhD level biostatistician that says, I'm willing to mentor this master's research instructor. And so this would get you at a total direct cost of about $45,000. If you're submitting an R01, this again is the case where you're going to want a PhD faculty biostatistician on as well as a research instructor. So again, this would be like 10% year 1. Let's suppose you did 5% years 2 and 3, 15% in year 4, 20% in year 5. And this would be a case where, again, depending on the complexity of the data that you're collecting and the analysis that you're proposing, this is where that faculty member would be listed as a co-investigator on this project. And then they would have a master's level statistician under them. At this point, sometimes, ideally, I like to ask for 30%, just so that this is a real priority for this research instructor in, say, years 4 and years 5. So this would get you, again, to a total direct cost of about $150,000, $160,000. And again, all of these are just rough numbers, but these are to give you an idea of what you should expect in terms of walking into that relationship and the types of conversations that you would have. Okay, so here's a little bit, actually, this came from John Rice, if some of you know him, who was previously in our department and since moved to Michigan. But he liked to propose these, what might I consider if? So let's suppose that you're just not getting what you thought you asked for from the biostatistician. So realize that we are by necessity detail-oriented, concrete, and I would say really linear thinkers, right? Therefore, the amount of time for translation to go from big picture to desired output just takes time, right? And we're working through things like little by little, and sometimes there'll be a little hang up where all of a sudden like, oh, we're missing some data here. What are we gonna do? And this can, take us over into just an additional couple days of work trying to figure out what's the best approach to take for your study, and then coming back to actually implementing it. One thing to do is to request written summaries of expectation timelines and deliverables after each meeting, right? So like, are there tables? If you provide a mock table, that's great, because then I don't have to think about how you want to present it. I can say, oh, okay, you know what? Becky has this table that she wants, and so I'm going to help her fill in these numbers. And I can, or like, this is the type of figure, this is what I'm hoping to show with this figure. Great. Reply to either confirm or correct the summary, so as much as you can, just with communication. And set regular meetings or increase the frequency, right? If anything's on our calendar, I think all of us are that way, it's more likely to stay on the top of our priority list. What if you're sitting there saying, I'm just not getting results quickly enough? Again, establish a weekly check-in, even if by phone. Ask about other priorities and timelines. So I know, like, when I'm teaching, finals week is a big week because I'm writing a final exam, I've got extra office hours, students are pinging me left and right. And so those weeks are just really hard for me to accommodate extra work and to get other things done. So ask about that kind of thing, just so you have an idea of what's on their plate, and then try to make deadlines known as soon as possible, right? So if you tell me, okay, I know you've got a lot going on, but February 15th, I've got this abstract deadline, then I know, okay, we've got to get things done. I can either get done this week, or, oh, I've got time to get this done next week. And again, our workload and tasks can change over the course of a day. So 1 minute when it seems like everything's free, all of a sudden we'll sit here and go, oh shoot, now I'm underwater. But as long as we have these conversations about deadlines and timelines, then we can be cognizant and responsive to those. And then also realize that we're often unable to predict how long something will take. This goes with research in all aspects of research, and I know you experience it on your end as well, right? Sometimes recruiting participants takes longer than you anticipate. Same thing happens to us when we start digging into a data analysis. Things that can appear really simple to start, when we start digging in, we go, oh shoot, you know what? That's not a suitable analysis for this data. We're going to have to take a different approach. And now I need to go read up on some papers on that approach, and so that I can come back and do this. And so, we do our best to predict how long things will take. I often do my best prediction and double it just to make it realistic, but then still, realize that sometimes it's just difficult to adhere to those expectations. I want results for an abstract due next week. So one thing we would say is consider the cost benefit of submitting an abstract with maybe, I'm going to say like a half-assed or just minimal effort data analysis versus having to change it later. So if you come out in your abstract and you say, we found X change and here's the impact of our intervention, and then we realize, oh, you know what, that wasn't quite the right approach to take for this data analysis, you're going to have to retract what you said. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, remember that there's a lot of steps that go even into a simple model. So like data cleaning, right? Checking for duplicates, outliers. If you've already done this, that's great, because that helps us as just like a baseline. But even doing data descriptive takes time. Model construction, thinking about collinearity, thinking about the assumptions of any analysis takes time. Code review, discussion. So sometimes like just turning things around in a week, it can sound simple, but it's not always that simple. Again, we can try it, but we just have to realize that with those kind of timelines, there's only so much sometimes that can get done. I'm using a new data set, or a data set new to the analyst. So it takes time for us to get to know data, right? Accelerates the process if you know the strengths and limitations of the data set. So what it can and can't do, like if you know that, that you don't have missing data, or that you only have this amount of missing data, those kinds of things. If we've worked with you before and we have an idea of what the data are, that's really helpful, because then again, it won't take us hopefully as long to get familiar with it. It also is really helpful if you send around other papers that use the data set. So statistics is a science, but it's also an art where sometimes you have a couple different options of how to analyze the data. So if you send us a paper on ways that you've analyzed it in the past or similar data sets, that tells us, it helps us get familiar with what's standard in your field and just can help us get a roadmap for the data analysis a little bit more quickly. So what if you come to me and you say, I want to do some or all of the analysis myself? We say, excellent, but let's talk a lot, right? So we love, I mean, hopefully in this collaboration, our knowledge of your domain, your scientific domain is increasing and your knowledge of biostatistics is increasing, right? Not that we're going to be able to say in project 2, hand over the analysis to you, but that's what's hopefully coming out of this collaboration. However, we want to make sure that that we know what the analyses that you're doing so that, again, we can add it to our code or just ensure that we have your code to double check things. I always love to be able to just do a quick replicate of when I'm working with someone and they say, okay, I ran this ANOVA. Okay, great. I would love to get the data and just, you know, when I'm watching Netflix in an evening, check it and run the ANOVA myself to make sure I get the same numbers. And it just ensures that what's going out has had second set of eyes on it. Again, typically I don't want to be on a paper unless I've been able to do that double checking myself. My paper submission is due tomorrow. If we've seen earlier drafts, this helps a lot, right? Because that means we're just doing a final read through. Again, we always want to be able to have that final read through before things go out the door with our name on them. But realize that we might not have time to check each and every number. We want to, and this takes time. So again, hopefully we're not working on a one-day notification here. My revise and resubmit is due tomorrow. In many ways, this is a lot more difficult because we need to reorient ourselves to the data set. We need to refamiliarize ourselves with our code, review the analyses, help with your reviewer response. Again, if you get a paper back that's revised and resubmit, let us know right away so that we can write the deadline of when that resubmission is due, and we can hopefully make a plan of like, do we need weekly meetings leading up to that? How are we going to work forward so that we don't hit these hard deadlines? So what are things, just to give you an idea of like what makes, let's say, our blood boil or our stress levels just, you know, reach the top of our heads? One thing is requests for too many tables. So if you we said it's great if you can lay out tables that you're looking for, but if you send us 10 pages of tables, or you've got 20 different hypotheses that you want to test and you want p-values for, that can be hard for us because it's just a lot of little things that, for tables, first of all, that might be something that you can handle yourself, but also it just feels like we've lost ourselves in the science, right? We want to be, our main goal here is to really define the hypotheses that you're interested in. What are your main research questions? And be really systematic about answering those questions and analyzing each of those things. Vague analysis plans, this goes along with that. Expectations and hypotheses are really difficult because it's really unclear on where we should go. Analytic plans that we can't adapt to the data or circumstances is really hard. So if you say, I want to do, you know, a 2A ANOVA, and we come back to you, we go, you have 3 factors, we just are not running a 2A ANOVA, then we need to have some more conversations about that. Last minute emergencies, I think that goes for everyone, and analyses submitted that haven't been reviewed by us. Again, that just, we want to take pride in our work just like you do. And so just allow us in on that. To have the second look or a last look before anything goes out the door. So again, ideally, what do we need, or what would be an ideal plan? Operationalize key variables. We'll talk a little bit about what this means, but this is really translating the science of what are the predictors, what are the outcomes, what's the population we're working with. A prioritized list of tasks is ideal. If you have manuscript ideas, like we want to write 2 different manuscripts, here's the topics, here's the hypotheses that we want to investigate in each, that's great. Timelines, mock tables for papers. And then what can you expect on your end? Well, again, we're going to deliver to you results that are clear and interpretable, right? We're going to meet to talk about them, to talk about, you know, again, what are the limitations? What can we actually say? How should we interpret these things? What are secondary analyses that would be good to follow up on? We will write and give significant input to the methods and data analysis section of the paper. This is another reason why we really want to have understanding of the context of your science, because when I don't have the context of the science, it's really hard for me to even write the method section to talk about the variables in an intellectual way. and charts and or graphs, obviously, that for your publications or presentations. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes or so here, I'm just gonna kind of take us a little back and talk about statistics refresher and just some big picture ideas that we should have in mind. Again, you should never feel walking into these collaborations like you need to go back and review your statistics course material, right? We are happy to sit down and have conversations and remind you of how we think about things and how we put the pieces together. But just for some of you, I thought I might just talk about this for a little bit this morning. So when we're discussing hypotheses, we really want to operationalize your data. What that means is we typically think about X as our predictors. Can we list out what are the predictor variables in your study? Y, what are your outcomes, right? So often we talk about X predicting Y. These are just placeholders for any predictor, any outcome. And then what's the population that you're studying? What was the inclusion criterion? How much does your results generalize to the broader population? So biostatisticians will push you to identify these key variables and think about the causal relationships between the variables and potential confounders. We're going to want to really clearly outline primary, secondary, and exploratory aims or hypotheses. So even if you're coming in, you've already collected data and you're not saying in the grant phase, we're still going to say, okay, what are your primary hypotheses you want to investigate? And what are the secondary? Power and sample size calculations are geared towards the primary aims typically. And if the secondary aim is really important, we'll make sure that we're powered for it. But just know that's another reason that we like to make this distinguish between primary and secondary aims or hypotheses. So when we go into talking about sample size and power, this is something that we often deal with when helping with grant submissions, is that your sample size is really contingent on the design, analysis plan, and outcome. All three of those things impact what the sample size that you need. So if we change the design of the study, that will change the sample size that's needed. What can happen with the wrong sample size? Well, the first thing is that you may not be able to make conclusions because the study is underpowered. So if you have too small of a sample size, you're considered underpowered and you're getting results that are not significant because either the treatment doesn't work or you just didn't have enough sample size to detect it, right? So that's an issue with being underpowered. That's one reason that the NIH and all the other grant funding agencies require you to do a power calculation because they want to make sure that you're not going to fall in this camp of your sample size was just too small to detect the difference that is there. Now, you can also have an issue if you're overpowered. So if your sample size is too large because you waste time and money. So if you're sitting there asking the NIH for $500,000 and because you're trying to say find a tiny difference between two groups, they might come back to you and say, okay, you might be able to find statistical significance, but that's actually not clinically relevant, right? Say if we increase, or say, if on drug A, people lose 30% of their, weight, and on drug B, people lose 29.9% of their weight. That's really not a clinically meaningful difference. So this is another reason why we want to make sure that you're not overpowered, that you're not asking for more resources than needed to look at this question. So sample size always requires us to make some assumptions. For example, we need to answer these questions about what difference do you expect between the groups? How much variability do we expect in the measurements? And what is a clinically relevant difference? Those are questions that you're going to hear us asking over and over. We can't give you these estimates without preliminary data. So these are really coming from the literature. So we'll ask things like, what does the literature say about the effect size? Are there studies on other populations that we might be able to pull over and use here to help understand what type of sample size we need for this study? Even if you're firm on a sample size, well, first of all, you should be prepared that the biostatistician might come back with a power that you don't like, right? So sometimes people come in and they say, okay, I can recruit up to 200 participants. Here's what I'm trying to learn. Here's the clinically relevant difference. And we'll come back to them and say, your power is 30%. Like you just are not going to be able to detect that difference with that sample size. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? And another reason to contact a biostatistician early, because we might be able to change up the study design or something like that to increase our power or to think about answering a different question. So there's all sorts of common study designs. A lot of people are probably most familiar with randomized control trials. Those are ideal. We can also talk about cluster randomized trials. Equivalence or non-inferiority trials is another one that we sometimes get. a larger sample size is needed for these. These are when we want to show that, say, 2 drugs are equivalent, or 2 treatment regimes are equivalent, or one is not inferior to the other. Non-randomized intervention studies or observational studies. A couple things to keep in mind for these studies. For non-randomized studies, you're looking at differences or associations. You often require a larger sample size because you need to adjust for confounding variables, since you weren't able to randomize people into the 2 groups. So you typically will require more samples. Often they can be easier if you're just getting observational data, but you do need larger samples. Remember, the study primary outcome is the variable that you're computing the sample size calculation for, but if you have a secondary outcome that's really important, we typically want to make sure the sample size is sufficient. So your grant will read something like, we require a sample size of X to address our primary aim or our primary hypothesis. However, this is also suitable to address our secondary hypothesis. And again, you would do a sample size calculation there as well, just to ensure that you can still answer that question. If you are expecting that you will have some loss to follow-up or some non-response or lack of compliance, then we want to incorporate that into the sample size, right? So for example, if you expect 30% of your sample to lose 30% of your sample to attrition, then your original sample size should be multiplied actually by this 1 over 0.7 or 1.43 to allow for this loss, so that when at the end of the study, you have sufficient number of participants. Hypothesis testing terminology. So this is kind of gets back into our, what are statisticians, how do we think? We think in terms of these things of null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. So in typical form of these, your null hypothesis is typically no difference. It's the boring thing, right? It's the status quo. So again, if we were testing treatment A and treatment B, it would be that these things result in exactly the same outcome. The alternative hypothesis is there's actually a difference between these 2 different treatment regimes. Our significance level of a test, we usually typically call this as alpha. Alpha, in almost all cases, is set to 0.05. This is the probability of rejecting the null, so us concluding that there's a difference when there's actually not. We call this our type 1 error. Our power is the probability of rejecting the null, so saying that we're going to say, okay, this is not true, there is a difference, when the alternative is true. So this is our goal, right? We want power in our studies. We want to be highly powered or well-powered. So this is, again, concluding a difference when there is a difference and the underlying population truly exists. This requires us to specify what the difference actually is. So we have to pick an alternative, which is, again, that clinically relevant difference that we want to be powered to find. And our p-values here are the probability of observing the results as extreme or more extreme under the null. So typically when we run a hypothesis test, we compute a p-value to say, if there was no difference between, say, treatment A and treatment B, what is the likeliness I would have observed the data I did? That's our p-value. If our p-value is small, that says that it's very unlikely that this null is true. And that's when we end up concluding the alternative. So here's just our errors in hypothesis testing. If you look in the columns here, if this is reality, so either the null is true, not significant, or the null is false, significance, meaning there's a difference between our 2 groups. And then we have the outcome from our research study. So did you reject H naught? Did you say that there is a difference between our groups? Or did you fail to reject, meaning there's no difference? So the green boxes here are the correct decision. So let's suppose, again, reality is that the null is true. There's no difference between my treatment regimes. And I failed to reject it. That means I did the right thing. There's no difference and I can't find a difference. Alternatively, if the null is false, so there is a difference between my treatment regime, and I do reject H naught, saying there is a difference, that's our power. That's our correct decision. So this is, again, where we're hoping to lie when we're doing these studies. We can have 2 types of errors. Then we can have an error when the null is true, so there's no difference, but we say there's a difference. This is that alpha. We restrict this to be 0.05. Again, a 5% chance that we make this type 1 error if the null is true. So what are quantities that affect power? Study design, the distribution of your data, your outcome. So this is like, how accurately can you measure your outcome? If there's a lot of variability, then it's more difficult for us to find a difference. Whether or not you're doing a 2-sided test or 1-sided, are you trying to show that there just is a difference between treatment A and treatment B, or do you actually want to show, say, treatment A is better than treatment B? Your type 1 error rate, again, typically this is fixed, so we won't change it. the size of the difference to be detected, this effect size, and finally your sample size. So I think I've just got a couple more slides here to wrap up. One cautionary note on sample size statements. We typically won't take previous studies. You might say, oh, a previous study in the area recruited this many people and found a highly significant result. Therefore, a similar sample size should be sufficient. That's really cannot be used to justify a sample size. Previous studies can get lucky, but these previous studies can be really helpful in us determining the parameters to go into it. For example, the variability of the outcome and what was the difference that they saw there, so a clinically meaningful difference or effect size. Another thing we want to avoid is to say something like the clinic sees around 50 patients a year, of whom 10% refuse. Therefore, over 2 years, our sample size will be 90. Although most studies need to balance feasibility with power, that should not be the sole justification for your sample size. So typically we want to find a detectable difference and then assess if it's clinically meaningful to say, okay, if we have 90 patients, what type of difference can we find? And is that reasonable? And then you can say, that both 90 patients is feasible given the patients that we see in the clinic, as well as results in this clinically meaningful or associates with this clinically meaningful effect size. A couple issues that come up, sometimes you just don't have any prior information. So instead of saying sample sizes are not provided because there's no prior information, it's better to conduct a pilot study. Or if it's for a pilot study, you actually often don't need to have the sample size calculation. That's the whole purpose of doing the pilot study. Another thing that comes up is if there's no information in the standard deviation of the outcome. This is one that can be a little bit harder to find. We can give the size of the difference that might be detected in terms of number of standard deviations. So this gets a little bit into the weeds here, Cohen's d, if you're familiar. If that rings a bell, great. If not, when you come talk to your biostatistician, they will tell you about it. And oftentimes we can protect ourselves with either a high sample size or you'll use a wide variety of possible standard deviations. And in your grant, you can kind of run a couple different scenarios to say, if it's this, here's the sample size we need, and just show that you can that those sample sizes are within the feasible set of what you're able to collect. So just the final things to remember, it's just an estimated sample size. Sample sizes that are too large or too small waste resources. So we really want to balance, well, again, both statistical and practical considerations when we do this. Changes in your experimental design will affect the sample size. So beware that if we go and change the design, we're going to have to start back at the beginning. And the sample size is calculated for the number of subjects who finish the study, not those that enroll. So we're always thinking about, again, how many do we need at the beginning? If you do think that you're going to have attrition or dropout, we want to factor that in with recruitment numbers. So acknowledgements, again, I just want to acknowledge some of this material came from John Rice, who previously worked with the center, Matt Bolt, who's here today, Mary Samuel, and then a few other resources that I used in preparing this. And this was Matt's takeaway, and I really appreciate it. And he ended up with saying, who likes candy corn? Statistics is really like candy corn. I hate candy corn. I don't know where you fall on this, but not everyone likes candy corn, and that's really okay. That's why statisticians are here to work for you. So as you're approaching your study, that's another reason, a push to engage a statistician. Push off the stuff that you really don't want to do, right? That's what we hire for. We get totally jazzed over your data sets, your tidy data with your clean variables and your observations. Like that just makes our heart pound like no tomorrow. So let us come in and help you with that side of things. I will end there and open it up to anyone's questions.
That was great. I'm an assistant professor in the section of nutrition in Department of Pediatrics, and I am getting ready to submit a K in June. And I would love to write in some training for myself for statistics. And I was wondering, like, I know that there are certain courses that we can take through, like CU Denver, and I was wondering if you had specific recommendations for training for biologists. And how to learn statistics better.
Yes, I would absolutely suggest either reaching out. I know that pediatrics has a biostatistician that has affiliated with that department. I think also, or feel free to email me. We should have a longer conversation is what I would say, because I would love to know what type of data you're collecting and what type of analyses then might be relevant so that we can pinpoint as you prepare that K award, like what are the specific classes that will really help you get that training that you need. There's a lot, we offer a large variety of courses, and some of them are really short and some of them are really focused and some are really broad. So just depending on where you're coming at, I think that that's going to affect that answer.
Okay.
Okay, well, I will hang here until no one else is in the Zoom room and everyone has decided to end. But feel free, again, if you're trying to figure out where to go, those CETA 1 hour consults are great. If you also just, now that you know me, feel free to just pop me an email and say, hey, like with Stephanie's question, feel free to pop me an email and say, hey, this is what I'm looking at. I'm trying to figure out where to go. And I'm happy to like either